What's up everyone? Welcome to Let's Play Dear Esther. Just gonna be a short little playthrough while me and Mike are between dual commentary games. So, one thing to note, the narrator here is pretty chatty. Fuck you, narrator, that's my job here. So, I know the narration points pretty well, so I'm just gonna talk in between what the narrator has to say. Get words in edgewise.
Dear Esther, the morning after I was washed ashore, salt in my ears, sand in my mouth, and the waves always at my ankles, I felt as though everything had conspired to this one last shipwreck. I remembered nothing but water, stones in my belly and my shoes, threatening to drag me under to where only the most listless of creatures swim.
So, the first few things I want to talk about are some of the controversy that this game inspired, some of the debate it inspired, and the history of the game, the development, and then I'll talk more about the game itself and its story. Also, very fucking disgusting airport-esque toilet. Don't ever poop in there. You will catch a cocktail of diseases from those. So, anyway, first some history. This game started out as a Half-Life 2 mod, and it was very much so an experiment. In fact, it was a research project led by Dan Pinchbeck at the University of Portsmouth. And the team we know today is TheChineseRoom, who, by the way, are also co-developing Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs with Frictional. Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs obviously being the sequel to Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Almost called it Last Light. Oh man, I'm really excited for Last Light to come out. Anyway, so I think around 2009, Robert Briscoe started collaborating with them to remake Dear Esther into a standalone game and give it a big shiny new coat of paint. Briscoe, by the way, was an environmental artist for Mirror's Edge, and I find the disparity between that game and this one which is all about thoroughly exploring environments through parkour, to this, really funny. They also made a Silent Hill-like game whose name I cannot remember. Started with a K. They also made a game called Conscientious Objector. Sorry, I just want to check my settings real quick. I'll keep talking through that. Conscientious Objector was a zombie game in which you could not kill anything and you were given one gun. It was a weak little stun gun. So if you're familiar with the history of the types of games that this developer's made, then the way Dear Esther turned out into this limited, interactive, experimental art game, quote-unquote, because it's such a weird, nebulous phrase, the way that this game turned out should come as no surprise. And this leads into my next point, that Dear Esther inspired a lot of controversy when it was re-released. The original mod was pretty low-key, low-profile. Not too many people really talked about it. When it was released on Steam as a standalone game, though, it received a lot of mixed attention. It garnered really high review scores, but from a lot of gamers, it elicited this response that, oh, this isn't a game, you don't do anything, this is boring, blah, 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 and I kind of want to address that controversy. And above all, I want to highlight something. Regardless of our ability to come to any kind of consensus on what is or is not a game, is that even a useful label?
At night, you can see the lights sometimes from a passing tanker or trawler. From up on the cliffs, they are mundane. But down here, they fugue into ambiguity. For instance, I cannot readily tell if they belong above or below the waves. The distinction now seems banal. Why not everything and all at once? There's nothing better to do here than indulge in contradictions whilst waiting for the fabric of life to unravel.
The only reason I'm even bothering with the argument instead of first talking about the specifics of the game is because this and other things like it are so readily dismissed by people because of the label.
Reading Donnelly by the weak afternoon sunlight, he landed on the south side of the island, followed the path to the bay and climbed the mount. He did not find the caves, and he did not chart the north side. I I think this is why his understanding of the island is flawed, incomplete. He stood on the mount and only wondered momentarily how to descend, but then he didn't have my reasons.
So what I'll do is I'll talk about some of the ways people have tried to define games. I'm going to leave out some of the more sketchy ones that just lead into a dead-end argument.
When someone had died or was dying, or was so ill they gave up what little hope they could sacrifice, they cut parallel lines into the cliff, exposing the white chalk beneath. You could see them from the mainland or the fishing boat, and know to send aid or impose a cordon of protection, and wait a generation until whatever pestilence stalked the cliff paths died along with its hosts. My lines are just for this, to keep any would-be rescuers at bay. The infection is not simply of the flesh.
I'm not going to get into sketchier definitions. Campster already handled the subject really well, so I'll link to his video in the description. I'm also going to be citing from his video on the topic a lot.
They were God-fearing people, those shepherds. There was no love in the relationship. Donnelly tells me that they had one Bible that was passed around in strict rotation. It was stolen by a visiting monk in 1776, 2 years before the island was abandoned altogether. In the interim, I wonder, did they assign chapter and verse to the stones and grasses, marking the geography with a superimposed significance that they could actually walk the Bible and inhabit its contradiction?
So, if this isn't a game, then we have to ask, what is a game? We have to actually flesh out a clear definition. Some people have argued, well, games are interactive. So are choose-your-own-adventure books. So, move on.
Dear Esther, I met Paul. I made my own little pilgrimage. My Damascus, a small semi-detached on the outskirts of Wolverhampton. We drank coffee in his kitchen and tried to connect to one another. Although he knew I hadn't come in search of an apology, reason or retribution, he still spiraled in panic, thrown high and lucid by his own dented bonnet. Responsibility had made him old. Like us, he'd already passed beyond any conceivable boundary of life.
This hermit, this seer, this distant historian of bones and old bread, where did he vanish to? Why, asked the farmers. Why, asked Jacobson. Why bother with your visions at all, if you're just to throw your arms up at the cliff and let it close in behind you and seal you into the belly of the island, a museum shut to all but the most devoted?
The next one might be something like games are fun and interactive. Well, you don't play a horror game for fun, so I guess those aren't games. Also, fun and interactive are both kind of slippery terms. They're not terribly clear. What most people mean by fun is that I came away with a positive experience. I either had fun or was engaged, and I liked what I got out of this. Fun is just an easy shorthand, but it's not accurate. Interactive is like that too. Is there a line between what is considered interactive enough to be a game and what isn't? If so, what's the line, and is that line just arbitrary? Well, then you have to move on and try to flesh it out even further. Games have a win state or a lose state. Well, what about MMOs or Minecraft or anything even similar to either of those? Minecraft only got an end state when they introduced the Ender Dragon. Was it not a game before then? Also, I think it's really interesting that people argue that Dear Esther should have been a short film. I read an article like that recently on Destructoid, and I cannot remember for the life of me who actually wrote that.
I've become convinced I'm not alone here, even though I'm equally sure it is simply a delusion brought upon by circumstance. I do not, for instance, remember where I found the candles, or why I took it upon myself to light such a strange pathway. Perhaps it is only for those who are bound to follow.
And I would imagine that the maker of Dear Esther, or the original creators, and Robert Briscoe, who worked to help re-release it as a standalone game. I would imagine that they would all resent that, like this idea that it doesn't work as a game and that it should only be a short film. But then again, one of, I think, Dan Pinchbeck's own arguments was that if he wanted to make a game with a linear story, he'd write a novel. Which is weird because it's an indictment of all linear stories and games. Like, this medium isn't appropriate for that kind of storytelling. It's a really incredibly snobby attitude. It's a really snobby attitude that's just as bad as accusing Dear Esther of not being a game and then dismissing it on the premise of that argument. In fact, it even implies that because this isn't a linear story, it would be ill-suited to other media. As if, say, film can't tell fractured, non-linear stories. Memento springs to mind immediately. To sum that up, I don't think it would be any better as a short film. If you think it's boring to play, imagine how boring it would be to watch one long tracking shot of the narrator strolling towards the lighthouse like this. You know, if you were gonna turn Dear Esther into something within another medium, maybe a novella would be suitable, like written in a similar manner to The Color Purple or something, like memoir style. But none of these things give the opportunity to pause, to turn around, to take in the beauty, to find objects and scrawlings on the wall that may lend meaning to your interpretation of what's going on. And they can't capture the randomized aspect, which I personally think plays very heavily into the ending, but that is a topic for later. So I mentioned that there are a lot of randomized elements in the game, and that includes items that we've seen so far.
Dear Esther, I have now driven the stretch of the M5 between Exeter and Bristol over 21 times. But although I have all the reports and all the witnesses, and have cross-referenced them within a millimetre using my Ordnance Survey maps, I simply cannot find the location. You'd think there would be marks to serve as some evidence. It's somewhere between the turn-off for Sanford and the welcome brake services. But although I can always see it in my rear-view mirror, I have as yet been unable to pull ashore.
There are a few fixed items. I think the chemical symbol, I think the chemical symbol in the first house is always there. On the table where there was like the little ethereal-looking map, that can sometimes be different. The sheet music can be different. Sometimes you'll find candles or books or degrees. I think there was a degree back in the house in the room with the symbol on the wall with the chemical diagram. So on top of the randomized items, the narration is also randomized. There are fixed trigger points where the narrations start playing, and once you hit one of those triggers, it picks from a pool of different monologues that the narrator can choose to speak. And again, I think all of this randomization plays heavily into what the game is all about, or at least that's the way I read into it. And I can't really get into that until the ending, because I think the ending really ties all of that together in a nice way. You can certainly read different things into this. I've never been one to promote authorial intent, at least for the most part. Sometimes the context that authorial intent provides can sometimes be really helpful. I've always believed that art is not about what the artist puts into it, but what the audience takes away from it. I mean, I'm sure you've all had those experiences with stubborn English teachers, professors, what have you, who they assign you a book, and their interpretation, the meaning that they got out of it, it's as good as law. If you have an alternate interpretation of it, it is incorrect. And that's not to say that all interpretations are equally valid, because you can come up with an interpretation that is just not supported by anything that's actually in the work you're interpreting. Also, this is going to be the last narration point coming up for this episode, so I'm going to go and end the episode after that narration ends. We'll talk more about the story in the next episode. Thanks for watching, guys. Take it easy. Have a good one.
I had kidney stones, and you visited me in the hospital. After the operation, when I was still half submerged in anesthetic, your outline and your speech both blurred. Now my stones have grown into an island and made their escape, and you have been rendered opaque by the car of a drunk.